several years I've been asked by students, what is the best type of paper to use for watercolour? Why does my paper go bumpy when I paint on it with watercolour? Why is watercolour paper so expensive? And is there a more reasonable alternative? Today I'm going to answer these questions whilst reviewing some budget and premium brands of papers and testing them to see which ones are the best for different types of watercolour techniques. If you are an experienced artist, this probably isn't a review for you. This is more for beginners who are learning about different types of papers and are trying to make decisions about whether to invest in premium or budget papers. But you are welcome to watch to see the outcome of the results. So the first thing we need to talk about is GSM. This is really important with watercolour. GSM stands for grams per square metre. So this is really important when you are choosing your paper. And you'll see when we're testing the papers out how important this is. The first type of paper that we are choosing in the test today is by a brand called Seawhite. It's a cartridge paper and it's 140 GSM. The second type of paper the second paper we're going to be looking at is Frisk, which is 220 GSM. Now it mentions on the media that you use or you can use that it will take a light wash. Now this is 220 GSM, and when I spoke about GSM I forgot to mention that the reason that you should be looking at your GSM when you're choosing your paper is this determines the amount of water that you can use on your paper, and this is why I'm going to be looking at a wet on wet technique test and a wet on dry technique test, just so that you can see the importance of choosing the GSM on the paper that you can use. But also this is why I'm choosing cartridge paper, because very often I get asked, why can't I use photocopier paper? If you would like to see the effects of watercolour on photocopier paper, I have a clip called Watercolour Do's and Don'ts. So if you would like to see why you can't use watercolour on photocopier paper, it may be worth you looking at that clip. Students often ask me, what's the difference between wood or cellulose based paper or cotton based paper? This is important as this determines how the paper behaves and reacts to the paint. Paper that is made out of wood is usually a lot cheaper than cotton paper, but the downside of this material is that because of the structure of the paper, the paint doesn't flow properly and can create streaky washes. It can also discolour with age. If you are thinking of selling your work, this could be an issue. You will find that the same paint will react differently when it is used on 100% cotton paper. Another thing to take into account is whether the paper is 100% acid free, as this means that your work will be more age resistant. Cold pressed paper is one of the most popular types of watercolour paper because it is so versatile. It is made by pressing through cold metal rollers, and this is what creates the texture. It gives your painting texture, but is also good for wet on wet technique as it holds water. So we now move on to our premium brands of paper. The first one is Arches. Both of these papers benefit from being 100% cotton and being sized using natural gelatin. Now this got nothing to do with the actual size of the paper. It just means that they have a treatment which means that the core of the paper means that they benefit from not being affected by the paintbrush and not tearing if the paintbrush is used a significant amount of times. The last paper that we're going to be using in the test is another premium brand. It's 100% cotton and it's hot pressed. It's the only hot pressed paper that we will be using in the test. I don't expect it to do well in the wet on wet technique, but I do expect it to do well in the wet on dry technique. I very much hope that it does, considering the price point. Now, hot pressed paper is a paper that is pressed through two metal rollers, making the surface flat and smooth. It's better for detailed illustrations, and I prefer to use this paper for portraits, but as I mentioned, this paper is not good for wet on wet technique. Now before we move on to the tests, I should mention that it's very difficult to find one paper that suits all of the techniques that you're using, and I very much expect at the end of the test to be finding two different papers. I don't expect to find a paper that is good for both wet on wet and wet on dry. If that's the case, that would be amazing. So let's go on with the test to find out, is it going to be a budget brand? Is it going to be a premium brand? Let's find out. So for the first test, we are going to be doing wet on wet technique. I'm going to be looking for several things in this test. The main thing is, does the paper withhold the water? How does the water absorb into the paper? Does the paper warp? Sometimes, even if the paper is stuck down to the surface, it still warps considerably. I am expecting the cartridge papers to warp. And if they warp, what will happen is the water will collect within those areas in the paper. Normally, I would use a pipette and take out those areas, but I'm going to leave them and see what happens. So I've applied a layer of clean water to each of the pieces of paper, as I would do normally if I was doing a wet on wet painting. And then I'm going to start applying washes with my paintbrush. I am using silver paintbrushes here, and all of the items I am using in today's demonstration you can find in the description below. So I'm applying layers of paint. I'm then going to leave them to dry. I will show you afterwards what each of these samples looks like when they are wet, and then I will show you the dry samples at the end. I will be basing the results on what these pieces of paper look like when they have dried. Some of them look considerably better when they have dried. So because I mentioned earlier that I would usually use hot pressed paper for painting portraits, I thought it would be appropriate to paint a facial feature. So I chose to paint some lips. I am including the colours that I have used in case you wanted to try this test for yourself. And I am going to paint 7 pairs of lips. And by the end of this test, I was really bored of painting lips, but I have done this. I have painted the lips, and I found the papers, all of the different types of papers, very different. So I started with the Arches hot pressed paper, and I found that using this paper was very smooth, but there were tiny little grains within the paper. That was the only thing that bothered me, because I found that adding the details was really good. I found that the water absorbed into the paper very easily, but not too much that it was dry. I found that the paint went into the paper really easily and it flowed. The real test will be when we apply the pencil later. I should mention that there's a second element to this test too, in that I will be adding pencil details, because very often with my portraits in watercolour I add pencil details on at the end, and this is an important element because with cold pressed paper you will find that you can see the pencil, the paper texture, and obviously you don't want to see that. So that will be a second element of the test, and that will be important to determining which paper is the one that is the strongest. So we're now moving on to the 2 cartridge papers. Though these ones didn't perform that well in the wet on wet test, I do expect these ones to perform better in this test. I'm applying less water and they should perform better because they are a smoother surface paper. So the one at the top, the Seawhite, though I didn't add that much water, there was a slight buckle and the water sat on the surface for a while, didn't soak into the paper. It did take time for the water to soak in, but it did perform really well and took the details in. Because it didn't soak into the water, you'll see that there was a slight bleed when I added the second layer of paper. Now, though I shouldn't really be doing wet on wet, I did a tiny bit of wet on wet, and I did want the paint to blend. This worked better on the second paper at the bottom, the Frisk. It blended well, it smoothed in easily to the paint details, despite the slight buckle in the middle, which could have been a bit of a problem, but it was fine. Although this also did take time for the paint to soak in, but other than that they both worked really well, and we'll see at the end whether they worked well with the pencil detail. So now we come on to the Florence paper and the Rowney paper, two budget cold press papers. So the first paper at the top is the Florence paper. We had a similar issue to the one that we had when we were testing it for wet on wet, and that is that it dries out really quickly, and also it didn't blend, which is part of that issue with it drying out really quickly. However, I found that adding the details was really easy when I was painting, which I didn't expect to find with it being cold pressed. The bottom one, the Rowney, I found again it dried out really quickly, and it wasn't easy to add the details with it being cold pressed. However, there was a really strange issue, which was the pigment sitting on top of the paper, which I've never come across before. So that was quite strange, but it didn't seem to come across when the results came out at the end. So the final two paintings in this test are the budget brand Canson, which is at the top, and 100% cotton Arches, which is at the bottom. Now, the one at the top, I had very mixed feelings about this, because the skin tone at the back, we had watercolour blooms. It made a complete mess. And when I came to painting the lips, it worked really well, and I was very surprised. So this was why this judging of this particular brand of paper became quite difficult for me, because as I was working with it, it became easier and easier to use. So that was quite a difficult one for me to judge at the end. The Arches at the bottom was as I expected, because I have used this for doing portraits before, so I kind of knew what to expect with this. It blended really well. The painting of it was really well, but when you see the results at the end with the pencil, you will see why I wouldn't use this for portraits and why it probably won't be number one, giving a clue away there. For the final part of this test, I'm going to show you adding details in pencil on top of the lips. Now, this may be something that you've never thought of doing before, but sometimes there's tiny details that it's very difficult to add with a paintbrush, and sometimes it can also give the picture a bit of a lift. If it's something you've never thought of before and you don't know what kind of colours to add or where to add the details and where not to add the details, it may be worth you watching a clip that I've made before called How to Paint a Portrait in Watercolours and Colour Pencils in 6 Easy Steps. The link is in the top right hand corner if you wanted to give that a look. So I will show you in a moment the results from all 7 images. I'm not going to show you me drawing all of the 7 lips with the pencils, because I think that's unnecessary, because I've used all the same colours. It's done in exactly the same way. I will put details of all the colours that I've used in the description below. So now we're going to move on to the results, and these results are very different for all of the different techniques. In 7th place is Canson Cold Press 300 GSM. This, I have to say, this paper was very disappointing, because it did claim that it didn't warp, which it did. And that's why you can see that big mark in the middle, because that's where the water collected. Now, usually I would have used a pipette to collect it, but I didn't, because I wanted to see the effects on the water, on the paper, how it truly would react to the paper. And I was just disappointed, because there was the claim that it wouldn't warp, and it did. So that's the first paper, and that is in number 7. Now in 6th place is the Frisk Cartridge 220 GSM. You can see it's warped. It has affected the finish of the paint on the paper. I wouldn't have expected it to have performed that well in the wet and wet, and bear in mind I did add a lot of water, so that's why it's 6th place. But let's see how it performs in the wet on dry test. So in 5th place is a premium brand Arches hot press paper. So this goes to show you that you should choose your paper wisely, and that you shouldn't really use hot pressed for wet on wet. You should be using cold pressed paper. In 4th place is the cold pressed 190 GSM, and when you bear in mind this is 190 GSM, it hasn't done that bad, because previously we've had a 300. There was slight warping, as you can see at the top. That's where you've got that band, so that was disappointing, and that's why it's in 4th place. Now I can't believe this one's in 3rd place, especially when I saw the way it was when I was doing the painting. It was warped, but when I look at the results in comparison to the others, it has blended perfectly. There's just one line on the left hand side, but the results are stunning. It has warped, but I'm going purely on the blending, so because of that, that's why this is 3rd place. In 2nd place was the Florence Cold Press 300 GSM. I have voted this, although it's 2nd place, the best budget cold press. So those of you that are beginning or on a budget, I would certainly recommend this as the best one for you as a cold press paper. It's blended really well, and I think for a budget paper it's great. The only thing that I would say is that it did dry out initially, and I did put a little spray of water on it to get it going, but as a budget paper this is a really good one to get started with. So here is the overall winner, Arches Cold Press 300 GSM. This is the one that I would recommend if you are moving on from a beginner to someone that's more experienced, or if you are planning to sell your work. You can see the clear difference here. You've got a really lovely blended wash, but this is what I would expect from a paper of this premium brand that is 100% cotton. So this is the paper that I would recommend if you are moving on in your journey, or if you can afford to spend the money on a premium brand paper. If you are getting value from today's clip, why not like and subscribe? That way you can ensure that you are informed of future content, and also I can put more content out like this. So when I talk through each of the papers in this section, I will show you first the watercolour without the pencil, and then the watercolour with the pencil. So in 7th place is the Rowney Cold Press 190 GSM. The first thing I'm going to say about this paper is it wasn't as easy to add the details, which is what I would expect of the cold press paper, but also it dried really quickly and the pigment sat on top of the paper. So that was a very strange effect that I was expecting with any of these papers really. Now, as I mentioned, I struggled with this one, but as it reacted so badly to the skin tone in the background, I had to put this one in 6th place. It would have gone in 7th actually if the foreground lip area hadn't gone so well. So you'd have to maybe try this one out for yourself, but I had to put it in 6th place because of the watercolour blooms in the background. Now, this is my go-to paper when I'm painting landscapes, but you'll see when I add the pencil that you can see the surface of the paper, and this is why this one goes to 5th place. Really, if you're adding detail, you need a smoother effect of paper. So if you're watching the first section, you would know that this was the budget paper of choice for wet on wet. However, it did struggle as in the first section because it dried really quickly. It didn't blend very well. However, it was really good for adding the details. And you can see when I've added the pencil, you can't really see the structure and texture of the paper. So you may be surprised to learn that the 3rd paper is a 140 GSM cartridge paper, and this is why I included these in the test, because I wanted to see how they turned out in comparison to the cartridge papers. The reason I've chosen this is you don't see the texture of the paper when I add the pencil shading, and it did react really well. I added a wash of watercolour and it hasn't warped that much, so it's come out really well in the test. So in 2nd place is another cartridge paper. It's the Frisk 220 GSM, and I've put this down as your best budget paper for wet on dry because it does everything that you need it to do. You can add details with pencil and it doesn't show any texture. It blended well. It was smooth and easy to paint the details on despite there being a slight buckle in the middle. It did take time for the water to soak in though. That was the only thing that I had an issue with. But overall, this is a really good paper without a great deal of buckling. So I hope that shows you that you don't have to spend too much money to start your watercolour journey. So in first place comes the Arches paper, the Arches hot press paper. The reason this comes first place is because it was so smooth. I really liked the way that it worked with the paint. There was a little bit of a grainy texture, but other than that, it worked really well, and I liked the results when I added the pencil. If you enjoyed this clip, then make sure you check out more clips like this in the watercolour playlist. Don't forget to look in the description below for details of products used in today's clip, and if you would like to tell me which watercolour paper you have had success with, please tell me in the comments below. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future content.